Hello and welcome to Dialogue with Global Thinkers. I'm Xu Qinduo. Globalization has been in retreat for more than a decade. The pandemic has proved to be a force to further disrupt world economic integration. Then we have the Ukraine conflict, which creates a huge gap between Russia and the West. At the same time, the U.S. continues its decoupling from China through means of nearshoring, friendshoring, or the rebuilding of global supply chains away from China. To better understand where we are now with globalization and how it is evolving, I'm today joined by world-renowned thinkers, policymakers, and scholars from across the globe. At the same time, we also have a strong presence of audience to weigh in on this important topic. Welcome to this discussion. Let me introduce our distinguished panel of guests here. We have Juma Altabayev, former Prime Minister of Kyrgyzstan, Esko Aho, former Prime Minister of Finland, and Hauke Heine, former Chilean ambassador to China, and Jörg Utka, President of EU Chamber of Commerce in China, and Peter Burnett, Chairman of the British Chamber of Commerce in Hong Kong, and Zhu Ning, Deputy Dean, Shanghai Advanced Institute of Finance. Thank you for joining us for this discussion. Let me start with globalization. Mr. Altabayev, how do you characterize the current status of globalization?
Globalization in the form which we used to understand it in is a big threat. Actually, what's happening is that geopolitics currently prevail over geoeconomics. Especially, as you mentioned, there is a COVID crisis as well as Russian military operation in Ukraine strictly puts globalization at the edge on exchange of the prioritization of public health and national security. So humanity not for the first time passing this difficult exercise. Everybody remembers that in 2007, 2008, during the global financial and economic crisis, there was a first withdrawal of active geopolitical globalization. As you may remember, during that time, Chinese export to GDP number dropped to 16%. So whenever politics came to the scene, unfortunately, globalization is withdrawn. That is what we're observing now, but now we need to find out the answer, what to do, and going back to the normal competition international scene, to that every country, every region would look for improve its competitiveness and to be in front of the world economic. It's not easy now, but indeed you are rightly and timely put this issue to the debate among the thinkers and academia and business circles. So we have to debate what would be the best and how to go back from pure geopolitics to normal geoeconomics and competition. Actually, I'm thinking that a crisis in Chinese character is the same character with opportunities. So I think that in general, this big crisis, political crisis, can reshape overall geoeconomic landscape and bring globalization back to the normal situation.
Normal situation, okay. Mr. Utka, you are from the business community. So what do you say where we are now with the status of globalization? We are, say, everybody agrees we are in retreat?
Well, I'll start with my old friend Martin Wolf from the Financial Times. He said globalization is not dead. It might not even be dying, but it's going to be changing, and it's changing very fast. The good old days of rampant knocking down of borders, the kind of reaping the low-hanging fruits is over, and we see a regionalization. We see more of camps developing. We have a breakdown in trust to some extent, certainly between the West and Russia, but also between the U.S. and China. I completely agree with the Prime Minister, it's a thing of the past.
Well, Mr. Aho, so we have too much politics interfering in the business. So that's probably one of the very important reasons for the retreat of globalization.
First of all, I think it's important to understand that globalization is not a recent trend. We have had globalization as long as we have had human beings on the earth. The fact is that we are interdependent. The level of interdependence has changed all the time. I think that if you go back to 1900, the level of globalization was maybe even higher, on a higher level than today. Somebody has measured that by looking at the price of grain, and the price of grain was most even year 1900, showing that global markets worked quite well in that time. Then we had the First World War. After that, we had major setback in globalization. Nationalism increased everywhere. We were returning back to the track after the Second World War. So in my opinion, we have to understand that there is no option to have a linear development. We have to understand that there are ups and downs in global trends. Mm-hmm. Secondly, I think we have underestimated some risks with globalization. We have seen that now. When we have a global pandemic, we have underestimated that kind of risk. We have underestimated as well how the supply chain is going to work, and how high level of risks we can take with that. So in that sense, I think we are getting certain corrections. I agree that it's not dead, it's not dying, but we need certain corrections in order to create better future for global economy.
Mm-hmm. Well, Professor Julian, academically speaking, so there are ups and downs of globalization. So now probably we are in the down period.
Yes, I think many people make the analogy between history and the pendulum. I think it always swings from one side to another, goes from one extreme to another. So I think we are probably going in some reverse mode. I mean, after 3 decades of very fruitful and very constructive globalization in the past, I think we are seeing some pause, if not reversal of the globalization. But if I could say something as an economist, I think there are 2 things that we're very certain about. One is, I think global trade and global organization collaboration are in the interest of everyone and every country. So I think that is a win-win situation to all countries. And 2, I think the past 1 century of globalization, as we have not seen before in human history, has also fostered unprecedented fast economic growth and technological advancement. So I think we should keep that in mind when we're debating or when we're disputing about the differences between countries. We also have to think about the bigger picture for the whole human race.
Mm-hmm. We touched upon several important aspects of globalization. We'll come back to go further on that. Ambassador Heine, you are from Latin America, but you are teaching in the United States. Probably people would say, when we are in retreat of globalization, people would say in advanced economies like in European country, the U.S., at the earlier stage, people, there are complaints about loss of jobs, outsourcing, or the loss of manufacturing to developing countries like China and other Asian countries. So is that, in recent times, that's early sign of retreat of globalization?
Let me say the following. It is important to keep in mind that the current phase of globalization, that some people would date to 1980 onwards with the invention of the PC and the coming on stream of global network, has been extremely beneficial to mankind. Something like 2 billion people have been lifted from poverty. So it is important, first of all, not to underestimate the benefits that globalization has brought to humanity. That's number 1. Second point is that, yes, we are currently undergoing a pause, as it were. Some people talk about de-globalization, but I would underscore the following. It is not clear that necessarily we'll go through that de-globalization. I would argue very strongly that technological trends in AI, in cloud computing, in other areas, will continue to push for globalization. Now, it is true that there are political trends, protectionism, populism that are trying to fight globalization. But it seems to me that the outcome will depend on whether it is technology and the trends that bring us together, or it is this protectionist populist movements that try to basically erect barriers and erect walls around countries and continents, whether they will prevail.
Mm-hmm. Well, Peter Burnett, when we talk about globalization or retreat of globalization, so what are the factors do you point to instead of blaming? Probably like what has led to this trend of decline of globalization or the erection of barriers around the national borders?
Well, I certainly think the pandemic of the last 3 years has not helped. Because one of the things that you need in any trade arrangement or in any investment arrangement is trust and confidence. You can put as much legal documentation around a transaction as you want. You've still got to basically understand and trust your counterparts. And the best way of trusting and understanding your counterparts in investment and trade is to meet them. And I think the lack and the inability to travel around the world and to have that in-person connectivity has made that very difficult. Now, we're conducting today's interview via Zoom. So on the other hand, there have been some benefits as well, which has meant that we are all able to get on a call at the same time and talk to you. But this is really an information sharing. I don't, I can't say that I will know any of my panelists better at the end of this call as I would do if we were in a room together personally. So I think there has been an acceleration in the deterioration, if you like, of globalization as a result of this terrible pandemic, which is still with us. Let's not forget, although it's improving. And that has led to a lack of trust and in some cases some distrust in terms of intent and in terms of policy and the reason for policy. I think there's clearly been a populist movement which has plugged into this as well. And although I'm a huge supporter of globalization or free trade, as we used to call it, and all of the benefits that it brings, it has brought some disbenefits for some disaffected people. And we shouldn't forget that. Steel workers in the US, miners in various parts of Europe and so on. And so, if we don't address employment and opportunity for people who have suffered some of the disbenefits, and let me say again, the benefits vastly outweigh the disbenefits. But if we don't address those disbenefits, then we are going to get a level of populism and populist rhetoric, which feeds a political discourse, ultimately, which can be anti-globalization.
Mr. Aho, I want to go back to you. You mentioned earlier about, the pandemic could be, or response to pandemic, could be, a correction course. Probably too much globalization. Some countries would say, we rely on supply chain too far away from our shore. We needed to have our supply chain probably based inside our country or neighboring countries. But do you see, if say we rely on another country is not, say that's not reliable, that's dangerous, there's a risk, like the European Union's reliance on this oil and gas from Russia. But what about relying on yourself? Is that safe?
Yeah, it's a good point. When looking back history, the Suez Canal, it was blocked for 6 days or something like that, and the whole global economy was shaking. Last time before that, it was closed. It happened 1967, and it took 8 years before it was reopened. And the global economy did not be that much affected. So this is an indication how far we are. And I assume that what has happened is that these global trends have been so powerful that we have had not enough capacity to understand all the consequences of that. I fully agree that the basic trend is fine, but we have to be able to understand negative consequences as well, and in some way to find solutions for that. And secondly, I think it's very important to understand that it was a political decision to open door for globalization. There were two major political changes that took place. China decided to open itself. Chinese political change, late 1970s, played a major role in this. And secondly, the collapse of the Soviet Union and creation of, let's say, common economic space in Europe. Those two played a major role in this trend. Unfortunately, geopolitics is now going to the wrong direction. But I assume that we have good reasons to let's say, to return back to not to normal, but new normal, where maybe there is a bit better balance between local interests and global interests.
Well, Peter Burnett, some people do, they blame globalization. For example, this pandemic because of the frequent travel, frequent visit, people-to-people exchange. Somehow that helped spread the virus. Or, people would blame, 2008 financial crisis as from U.S. to other parts of the world because we all use U.S. dollars, things like that. What's your response to that?
I think they're clutching at straws with that argument. To blame globalization for the 2008 financial crisis is really missing the point. The 2008, 2007, 2008 financial crisis was a consequence of greed and unregulated financial speculation, frankly. Now, it did have a global consequence, it's true, because capital was able to flow easily between countries and between investments, but the globalization was by no means the root cause. And as for the pandemic, I don't think you can blame globalization for the spread of the pandemic. This was a highly, highly infectious and highly dangerous virus that could have started almost anywhere in the world and spread extremely rapidly. Despite the efforts to control travel, which were brought in pretty soon after the initial identification of the coronavirus, it spread very, very rapidly, and it spread in country, not as a result of massive importation from outside. So I think they're clutching at straws. I think globalization, or free trade, as I prefer to call it, continues to add many benefits, but it's one of those phenomena which it's easy to take down off a shelf and say this is what's responsible for our current travails, without actually looking at the root causes.
Well, Ambassador Heine, do you see maybe two different narratives? If you listen to politicians from the U.S. or the European countries, they seldom nowadays mention or use the word of globalization or free trade or even fair trade. They don't use that anymore. But the developing countries, it seems like they are more in the mood of continuing globalization. For example, in Asia, you have RCEP, this regional trade agreement between ASEAN countries plus China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. Of course, CPTPP2 across this Pacific, 10, 11 countries. So is that the case?
Well, I think that's a great point, because in the earlier phase of the current wave of globalization, in the 90s and the early 2000s, the view was that globalization would benefit the North, that it was the United States and Europe that would be the great winners of globalization. Now, what is happening now, I find is most fascinating. It is the United States and many European countries that are retreating from globalization. And they talk about decoupling, and they talk about, and in fact, erect barriers and all sorts of walls to impede free trade and the free movement of goods. And it is countries like China and countries in Africa and in Latin America that say, no, we need free trade. So this is a remarkable turnaround that we have seen. It used to be that the United States was a great champion of free trade. It no longer is. It talks about fair trade. Now, that used to be the language of third world countries. So we're living in remarkable times. in which, it seems the world has turned upside down, and it is the countries from the global south that are championing free trade and globalization. It is very important, it seems to me, that we keep that in mind as China contends with the issue of this deglobalization that we are seeing. It should focus, the way I see it, on the global south and realize that that is where the big opportunities lie, and that is where the future lies. And let me give you one example that I find most remarkable. This example is BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. For the past, 9 years, we have seen how BRI has been criticized and decried by northern countries, saying that it is part of debt diplomacy, an effort to make countries in the global south incur debts and borrow money that they don't need and build white elephants that they don't need, and so on and so forth. Suddenly, they have changed their tune. And the G7 came up with this thing, PGII, Partnership for Global Investment in Infrastructure, and realizing, yes, actually, the global south needs infrastructure. And so now countries in the north are also getting into the act. And it seems to me that is why China should persist in its approach of defending free trade, working with the global south, and moving forward on initiatives like BRI, because that is where the future lies.
So, Mr. Whitaker, in a similar manner, China is a strong supporter of globalization or continuing globalization. In a similar manner, maybe the U.S. see, I see more and more problems with globalization. Does that also contribute to probably geopolitical issues between Washington and Beijing?
Well, China is definitely a major player of globalization. I'm not really sure they're an advocate of globalization. If they would be an advocate as much as they advertise, they would actually open up their economy much, much more towards other countries. China is a champion of exports and is very reliant in order to cherry pick on the import side. I think that's very important, that actually China is not just building bridges, but also buying from countries where they normally are now trying to go more into self-reliance. I think it's very important to see that also Europe should do this. Europe has been pretty much subsidizing agriculture, at the same time exporting things. They should buy more from Africa and the southern global economies in order to stabilize them and also give them jobs and not just developing aid. I think globalization in a way has been rather twisted over the last decades because of the mercantilism about a couple of economies. Now, nobody is a shining star and is innocent of all of the things, the US certainly not as well. But we have to recognize that actually, in order for every country to contribute, it means just lowering tariffs, lowering the borders, making business more easier. And in order to gain actually access for foreign business, for example, in my case here in China, in order to create jobs elsewhere. And that's actually lacking. It's a bit lopsided of what's going on over here. And China can do so much more in order to help globalization by opening up its economy further.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Aho, obviously, for every country, there's a lot to do, including China, probably, to further opening its market and to import more from, say, other countries, etc. But of course, there's a geopolitical politics. We mentioned that earlier. For example, China would purchase more technologies from the US. But the thing is, the US are very sensitive to some of the technologies, in particular high-end, like semiconductors. They would say, no, we would ban or prohibit some of the companies from exporting to China. What is that? We're talking about the globalization. That's probably part of deglobalization.
I think it's very important to understand that globalization is much more than only trade. Free trade is one part of globalization, but there are other aspects as well. Environmental aspect is getting more and more critical. There is technology aspect as well. How much collaboration we are able to create in order to get technological assets to be developed together. There is security aspect as well. And I think one of the reasons why we are in such a situation where we are today, one reason is that we have different understandings. What does it mean when we speak about globalization? For some countries, it means free trade, more free trade, open trade. For some countries, it means security. For some countries, it means something else. And I think this is something we have to have a dialogue. And Russia is a good example of those problems we face. We had, as mentioned here, we have had a lot of trade between Russia and the European Union. Actually, 2021, the European Union was the biggest trade partner with Russia. Russia's exports, 37% of Russia's exports went to the European Union. But the problem today is that you cannot pick up only trade. You have to have common rules in the field of security as well. And that is the biggest problem today.
That is a good point. I think, security, or say the overuse or abuse of the concept of security, probably, Mr. Odbayev, if we say even economic development or a particular sector of economy is something about a national security, naturally people would turn to protectionism. And then that's probably against globalization.
So if we will go in protecting our technology, in protecting our discoveries, inventions, if we will not allow scientists to talk to each other because of national security threats, then the world will be dividing among enemies, which nothing good about that. So globalization in that respect would be completely diminished. So in that respect, it's very important to understand what real security challenges and threats means. For example, attacks of US and some other Western companies against Huawei. What is this? Is it kind of unfair competition, or is it something which relates to the security? Because if you're cornering many companies, what the West is doing against Chinese companies, then China feel that they are under threat. So they will be made countermeasures. So scientists will not be, and technologists will not be able to talk to each other. It will not be progress, it will be regress. And again, a few of you today mentioned the word trust. This is the most important word all the time along the history, and especially now. As a famous German philosopher Franz Kafka said, if there is no trust, all talks are meaningless. So what we're seeing now is complete kind of withdrawals, retreat of the trust between people, which created by politicians. So unless we will be making some step to restoring trust, we will never be able to tackle global issues like public health, like climate change. These days, very little people speaking about climate change because everybody were overshadowed by these political events, potential wars, potential kind of nuclear conflict, whatever. And unfortunately, this situation is deteriorating. There is no kind of, we can't see the light at the end of the tunnel. In that respect, more debates, more analysis of the threats and opportunities, which trust will bring us to the normal situation, is really required.
Ambassador Heine, so I mean, two keywords probably, security and then the trust. The increased concern about the security, national security, economic security, and then before that is really a lack of trust between powers.
Yes, absolutely. Now, it is important here to keep in mind that what I would say is that these various blows that we have seen on the global stage, the pandemic first, now the war in Ukraine, and also the effect this has had on global supply chains, in a sense, I would argue, are only a forewarning about the next big one, as has been said, which is climate change. We are seeing, I understand, some of the highest temperatures ever recorded in Europe this summer. And so what is at stake here really is the very survival of humanity. So it seems to me to talk about security in narrow, old-fashioned terms and not realizing that, well, life on Earth 10, 12 years from now may not be what it is today because of climate change. Well, that's something that needs concerted action. In that sense, the danger that I see is that this lack of trust that we are seeing and this sort of uncoupling or decoupling of various economies from each other will lead to a situation in which we are unable to work together on fighting this truly big challenge that we face, which is climate change. And if we don't hang together on this, we'll hang separately, and that is not something I want to see.
Mm-hmm. Well, Junior, if you look at the, given what we have, geopolitical tensions and also lack of trust, security concern, if you look at the future of globalization, in particular, measures taken by the largest economy, the United States, for example, nearshoring, friendshoring, or rebuilding supply chains, for example, or industrial policies in terms of the CHIPS Act, to bring jobs back to the U.S., manufacturing jobs about semiconductors. Will that be successful? How likely it will work? Because that's against, what U.S. used to preach of market economy.
Right. I think it's quite interesting to see the U.S. is actually following some of the footsteps that China has set over the past decades. So it's quite interesting that I think people are talking about the competition of different routes of different institutions, and then we're seeing the benefits or the advantages of some of Chinese approach of doing things. So I think that's actually paving the road for a more chances for cooperation and collaboration between China and the U.S. in the way of, okay, what is the best way of not just to assert each country's power in each region, but to make the world a better place and to bring better life to the citizens of respective countries. So in that regard, I think, well, there is a chance for some success of the approach in the way that, well, I think we probably all agree the free market economy is not going to solve all the problem, and China's approach to infrastructure, to poverty lifting, to environmental protections have certain benefits over the existing system. So that being said, I think the U.S. is probably going to do that with the American characteristics in a way of that is going to fit better into the existing free economy in the U.S. So in that regard, I think it's going to be a transition on both countries' side. I think China probably more towards the market economy, whereas the U.S. more towards more intervention or more government support following China's successful example.
Mm-hmm. Well, Peter Bernard, obviously, what we are seeing is really about the strengthening of the hand of the government, either in the U.S. or other countries. People somehow, started to believe that there's a role to play for the government, or probably a much bigger role than previously realized for the government to play in the market function.
I think there's certainly an element of that, yes, and I think it's driven by a bit of a populist narrative in the media. And it's a populist narrative which also catches the attention of an electorate, and so to some extent, the political class has to follow it. But I still think that there are, powerful authorities in the West who don't believe in protectionism and don't believe in onshoring and nearshoring, and do believe in the benefits of free trade and comparative advantage, which all economists learn to write about at a very early stage. If I can be a bit historic for a moment, the one case study for me that I think reveals a lot about the disbenefits of protectionism are the Corn Laws in the United Kingdom, where I come from originally, and the Corn Laws were corn applied to all cereals, wheat, barley, oats, and so on, that were grown in the United Kingdom, and they were tariffs imposed by the then Tory political class on imports, and they were imposed to protect the landowners who grew more expensively these cereals than they could buy them externally from importing them. And this led to terrible famine, and it led to terrible poverty, and it led to riots, and it led to insurrection. And as the urban class was growing in the United Kingdom, they felt very, very let down by this act of protectionism. And it took actually a Tory Prime Minister, Robert Peel, to repeal the Corn Laws, to get rid of them. And when the Corn Laws went, there was this economic resurgence because people could then focus resource and capital on the productive parts of the economy. And some people would argue that this was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the repeal of the Corn Laws. And so, if we're moving in that direction now, then we are going to. It won't last. By the way, it will be. It may be long-lived. I hope not. I hope it's short-lived. But very soon the world will realize that it doesn't work because it's never worked in the past.
Good example, Mr. Aho. We know that globalization or global economic integration has brought us a lot of benefits. Poverty alleviation, more than 1 million people around the world being lifted out of poverty, and also easy access to these cheaper products and services, access to technologies, being shared around the world. So that's all the benefits, globalization brings to us. Do you think we are wise enough to realize that and then to do something probably to arrest the trend of deglobalization?
First of all, I think we have to recognize that in spite of all this discussion, certain global trends are still there. If you look at global trade, interdependence between Europe and China and the US and China, that interdependence is still there. Environmental independence is increasing because of climate change. So the fact is that these basic factors are there. I believe that we are going to see a certain decline in this trend because of geopolitical tensions, but also because of the fact that we have recognized that we need certain kind of insurance as well. COVID-19 was a good example for European companies. For example, how dependent we are, completely dependent we are on certain supply from Asia. We have to adjust that interdependence. We don't have to remove out of that interdependence, but we have to adjust that a bit. And secondly, I don't believe that decoupling between the United States and China is going to take place everywhere. There is going to be certain areas where we are going to see certain kind of decoupling, but in many other areas, this interdependence is going to stay, and it's going to be there in the future as well. That's why I think it's very important to see this whole picture, not only some problems we are facing, but the big picture is brighter, in my opinion, than certain elements of this.
Yeah, Mr. Aho makes a very good point. Now we have a few minutes left. We shall ask our audience to see if they have any comments or questions for our guests.
Hello, everyone. I'm speaking to you from Albania, Albanian Institute for Globalization Studies here. Thank you very much for the invitation and your impressive views. Really, it has been some food for the thought. I wanted to ask any of your speakers, if it's possible, that we have heard that these opposing voices towards globalization has been present for decades, but in the recent years, because of the pandemic, we have been trying to look inside, be these politicians inwards, be this politician or businesses and so on. And it's no secret that the winner takes it all approach has upset many around the world. However, as I could see from your point of views, it appears to be more a matter of convenience rather than a matter of trust between countries, between companies and so on. So if globalization is convenient for me at a certain point, I will go for it. If it's not, I will not go for it. And my question is, some of you mentioned, in order for globalization not to stop, because we all agree that the benefits outweigh the risks and the threats, we need some certain corrections you mentioned. In your point of view, which are the most urgent corrections that we need to make to this path of globalization? Thank you.
One of the things we should do is to get the WTO going again. I mean, we have a situation in which basically the WTO, the World Trade Organization, is paralyzed. It has been paralyzed, you know, it has no working appellate body. There's been no movement on the Doha round. It seems to me what we should do is empower it again so that it can perform its job, which is to promote more free trade and continue to help in pushing for liberalizing the world economy. I mean, that's something very concrete that could be done.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Aho?
I think one of the major challenges we face today is how to combine measures needed to save the world as far as environmental risks are concerned, how to combine these kind of efforts with free trade. I think that is something we have to be able to understand much better, to find out what kind of rules we need and common ground on that. If we are not able to find solution in that area, I think we are going to have more and more problems on that long term. But on the opposite way, that is a great challenge and opportunity as well. So that if we are able to succeed in that, I think it will give boost for globalization as well.
A boost for globalization. Any more questions?
Thank you for invitation, and I'm a student from Communication University of China. I have learned a lot about globalization from this dialogue. From my perspective, developed countries have occupied a dominant position in economy, culture, and other aspects for a long time, and it seems easier for them to get more opportunities in the process of globalization. However, for the developed countries that have been dominated for a long time, the situation is on the contrary. While gaining opportunities, many national features are gradually disappearing. So my question is, for the developing countries, how to seize the opportunity of globalization while reducing the risk of being assimilated by the international mainstream culture? Thank you.
Interesting question. Ambassador Heine? Yeah.
I can.
Yes. It seems to me it's very important here to keep in mind the following. It used to be that developing countries were afraid of globalization. Nowadays, they realize that growth and opportunity comes from openness, from free trade, from foreign investment, from working with the world. And it is the northern countries that are in retreat and are becoming protectionist. So I would argue that with the caveats that I said earlier, you know, not all globalization is good and you can't have too much of a good thing. But if it is well managed, the global south, the developing countries can reap great benefits from globalization, and they will continue to push for it. And it seems to me that is what China should do as well.
Well, on that note, we come to the end of today's discussion. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app or on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.